So Norm Gaume used to work for the state of New Mexico, and upon his retirement, he then became an environmental activist and fought for the river and the forest that he loves. You know, Norm is an expert, very literally an expert in water resources, natural resources. And so I thought it was really powerful and important to include him in the series of interviews because he could really talk to us about the value of constitutional environmental rights through the lens of a true expert. So I hope now that you will join me and listen to Norm Gaume and get the benefit of his expertise and the value of his perspective on why it is so important for us to pursue and secure a constitutional green amendment in the state of New Mexico.
Well, my name's Norm Gaume. I grew up in southern New Mexico. My grandparents were both small farmers in the Rio Grande Valley, south of Elephant Butte Dam. They were lured there by the irrigation project. Um, I'm a product of public schools in New Mexico. I briefly left New Mexico to work on a boat and also to my first professional job, but I became instantly homesick and decided I had to be back here where there's both green chili and mountains. I spent most of my professional career, I'm an engineer. I got a master's degree in water resources and moved back to New Mexico to work in the water and wastewater system in the public utilities. And after several jobs, I worked into a water resources position. Um, Helped change things for the city of Albuquerque to transition to a resilient and sustainable water supply system. Was asked to work as the Interstate Stream Commission director, a director of an agency that deals with interstate water issues in New Mexico. And when I retired, I continued to consult. But then the Gila Diversion Project came up. I'd actually been asked to work on that for the agency that I used to be the director of, and I didn't want to do that. And then I determined that they were trying to do some things that I knew from my personal experience just couldn't be done, was impossible. I thought they merely needed to be educated about the facts, but it turned out that this being a Republican initiative, they weren't as interested in the facts. They wanted to ignore them, as a matter of fact. And that led to my becoming an activist starting in about 2013. So I'm relatively new to the activism game, but I do have to say that shortly after, my wife still complains about the stickers that I put in the light switches in my house that said this switch turns on pollution in a power plant close by. And now I'm lucky enough to live off-grid in a beautiful place up in the mountains.
So, two questions. So you knew that the Gila Diversion Project was bad based on your personal experience. So the first question is, tell us a little bit about what was that personal experience that gave you, in addition to your professional expertise, that personal knowledge that was helpful, number one. And number two, what was the Gila Diversion Project? What was it going to do, and why did they want to advance it?
My family was relatively poor as I was growing up, and we spent our vacations and our time with family, and we would go to nice places for picnics. I lived in a little town called Deming, New Mexico. The Gila Wilderness was about an hour and a half drive away, and special family picnics. We would take the trip up to the Gila, and we also had vacations, around the perimeter of it. When I was a college student, I started backpacking in the Gila Wilderness, which you may know was the nation's first wilderness, created by Aldo Leopold administratively. And then when the Wilderness Act was passed, it became officially the nation's first wilderness. And one year when I was backpacking on spring break, I came across the flooded Gila River, and I was on the wrong side of it. I had to get to the other side. And always before, when I'd seen it, it had been a little trickle that you might get 1 foot wet, maybe two, but not up to your chest. Well, as I was crossing that river with my friend and I was looking upstream, said, there's an easier way to do this. I want to take a boat down this river sometime. So a few years later, I told my friend, I'll buy a boat if you'll go down the river with me. And we survived. It was that kind of a trip. It's a 3-day canoe trip through the wilderness. And matter of fact, one of the reasons the wilderness was set aside is because Aldo Leopold wanted people to be able to experience wilderness travel, the way that it once was. To make a long story short, I fell in love with the place. And, I had been in love with it before, but I really fell in love with it. And I spent a lot of my vacation time over the years, every spring, when the river rarely has enough water in it to take a boat down it, but whenever it did, I tried to be there. The Gila has an interesting water development history. And I won't go into the details of that now, but suffice it to say that there have been many attempts to dam it, and there are no dams on it, at least not in New Mexico in the headwaters region. So when I learned that the agency that I used to be the executive director of was again seeking to dam up the river, and the place for the dam was in the middle of the canoeing run that I had fell in love with, not in the middle, near the end, but still within it. And because I knew, having studied the Gila and looked at the history as a professional water resources engineer, I knew that what they were proposing was impossible. To make a long story short, I first tried to educate them. When it became clear that education was not the issue, I found out that in order to counter my professional criticism of their project, that they had hired, given a huge amendment, $700,000 to one contractor and another big amendment to another contractor to respond to my professional criticisms. But they'd done that secretly and illegally. So I sued them myself as a person for violation of the New Mexico Open Meetings Act. And I prevailed. It turned out to be very costly. They countersued me. And it was a difficult, arduous process that lasted for years before I finally prevailed in the Court of Appeals. But in the meantime, they chased one silly, stupid idea after the next. Instead of taking an overall view of the project, which would have told them it was infeasible, they just went from one dumb idea to the next one, literally, spending a lot of time and money on each one. And just recently, within the last year, their last idea proved to be without any merit. $16,000 an acre foot for water, and that price was underestimated. And so the agency, under a new governor, pulled the plug on the project.
Woohoo! Congratulations!
The unfortunate thing about it is they spent $16 million on the studies for that project. And the proponents of the project, I just, as a matter of fact, was chatting with one of my colleagues on that project, colleagues in opposition, who attended the meeting of the proponents down in southwest New Mexico. They didn't learn a thing. They still think that the water is there and that it's affordable and they can develop it and it's their birthright. So with all of this money spent and all of this effort, it's just a waste. The river's protected, but there'll be another attempt. And that's one of the sad things about being in the environmental protection business is that the winds aren't necessarily permanent winds. They seem to be ephemeral until memories fade. Or in the case of this project, the memory's not yet faded, but they're already plotting how they're going to try again.
So it's going to be a matter of who's in power politically down the line, you think?
This project is so expensive for so little water. I mean, you don't want to hear the details that make it infeasible, but it truly is. It's just simply not feasible. But tell that to the people who feel that they have a manifest destiny birthright to the water, and they're not interested in the facts. It's kind of hard to, it's impossible to have a factual conversation about that.
So, Can you, in addition to your powerful advocacy to protect the Gila, which you obviously and rightly view as a pressing environmental problem here in New Mexico, what are some of the other pressing environmental issues that you're concerned about for the state?
Well, I think the biggest one is the way that unchecked oil and gas development has just rendered big sections of New Mexico effective wastelands, and placed unconscionable burdens on the people, who live next to those facilities. I think that that's a huge one. Water is going to be a big one here. We live in a very arid region. Climate change is upon us. Temperatures have already risen 2 degrees Celsius in many places in New Mexico. The snows that used to feed the rivers, that used to result in the spring runoff that I was always out there playing on, in my boats. The runoff is just not nearly the magnitude it used to be. This year was an incredible example. The mountains that feed the Rio Grande in northern Colorado had hugely above normal snowpack, but the amount of water that actually made it down into the rivers and flowed into the state was only about 50% of normal. And it's one of the things that the scientists have been telling us would change, and here in this year, it became a fact.
So in addition to, we have just naturally that there's not as much water here in New Mexico as other parts of the country. Climate change, oil and gas. Are there other particular threats to the water resources that concern you?
Well, overuse. We just have no respect for the limits to our water resources. The problems that I personally helped overcome when I was an employee of the city of Albuquerque. The values were that you don't question the amount of water, you just go ahead and develop, to question the amount of water. Basically throws shade on the developer's plans to build, another subdivision or another city. So I think facing the limits to water supply, and now it's the diminished limits to water supply, is a huge deal. The other big issue is that New Mexico has never been a steward of its natural resources in any real sense of the word. It has been a natural resources development state. Lots of our employment is in the development of natural resources. And one of the results of all of that is that we used to have big aquifers in many sections of New Mexico that really are disconnected from sources of recharge or don't have much recharge. And years ago they had a lot of water, and today they are substantially diminished. And there's no thought for what the future holds. Right now the plan is to pump those aquifers to exhaustion, literally. And it's already happened on the east side of the state, on the Ogallala Aquifer, and in the area where they're actually taking huge amounts of fresh water for fracking in the oil and gas industry. So New Mexico may protect itself from overpopulation, but it will be because we've used up water and other precious resources that we just can't exist without.
So in this over-allocation scheme and this divvying up the water for the different players, different stakeholders, if you want to call them that, among the stakeholders, is there any place for nature itself, and or is there any place for the people who value, benefit from, in a myriad of ways, healthy environments that of course need water to survive? Are they anywhere in this allocation scheme of government?
Well, you're talking about the official allocation scheme, and I would say to a tiny, tiny degree. Mm-hmm. When I was a state official, and a little desert fish that lives in the Rio Grande that was the last of its cousin species to literally to survive, was declared endangered by the federal government. And as in the aftermath of that, water for species, for endangered species, was recognized as a beneficial use. Previously, the water officials regarded beneficial uses of water, which is the only official recognized use. They said that that required water to be taken out of the ground or out of a river, somewhere else and used. And that hasn't begun to play out yet. But in the future, it's going to have to, because the amount of water that we're going to have to live on in New Mexico, the sustainable amount of water, the water that's in the rivers, just simply isn't going to be able to be stretched to meet the needs of nature and the needs to support the environment that makes New Mexico a very special place to live, as well as all the uses of that. And for reasons that, to tell you the truth, I don't understand, even though those facts are pretty plain and recognized, I think, by quite a few people, we've yet to be able to get the critical mass behind planning to make those facts, upfront and recognized by the people and accepted so that we can talk about alternative futures. That's now just beginning, just beginning. We don't have a state water plan worthy of the name. The regional water plans that we have for various regions of the state really avoided the hard issues instead of tackling them head on. So water availability is going to be a big deal here.
So if there's a proposal, a diversion, oil and gas wants some more water, a developer, oh my, that was really phenomenal. Sorry.
I heard that on
Did you hear it? That was fantastic. Right, so there's what a special place you live in.
used to it.
Look at that, oh my gosh.
So those are the white-winged dove that fly up here from the city to eat the pinon nuts that are,
Yeah?
there's only a crop of pinon nuts about every 3 years, and we have a good crop this year. So those are white-winged dove. They're not native, but there's huge amounts of them in the city. They fly up here in the mountains and gorge, and this time in the evening they go streaking back home so fast that you can hear them on your microphone.
Wow, that's fantastic. That along with the hummingbirds. Okay, so somebody is coming into government. They want to be able to take some water for industry, for development, for a diversion, for one reason or another. And a person comes forth, maybe it's you, maybe it's somebody else or an organization, and says, wait a second, I need to keep that water in the river so I can enjoy it. I want to go boating down. Or I have an ecotourism business, right? And I need that water to be able to support my ecotourism business, whatever that business is, boating or bird watching. Or when those people come in and ask to be heard in opposition to one of these industrial takes or development takes, what is the level of voice they are given or place they're given in that discussion by the government officials that are sitting at the table that have to render that decision?
Well, they would be perhaps treated politely and listened to perfunctorily, but their issues wouldn't be given any real consideration. But there's a small issue with the premise of your question. The water is already spoken for like maybe 150 to 200%, so there is no undeveloped water, except maybe this water on the Gila River, which the reason that water is undeveloped is that a political deal was made by the Senate in the 1960s. It never was studied. There never was any evaluation of whether or not there was water. It was just declared that there was. I don't know what to say. I won't go down that rabbit hole anymore. But in order to get water for a new development, a developer would either have to, as is in the case with Albuquerque right now, have to go to Albuquerque and say, can we use some of your unused water rights? Will you let us be your customer? Or they would have to find a water right to purchase and transfer which would be through an arduous government process where lots of voices are heard, but the voices that you just mentioned wouldn't be given, much credence. It really, I think your question was, would those voices be officially recognized? And the answer was they might receive a polite reception, but nothing more.
So how is it? So we were looking, we were up on Navajo lands with Daniel So and Mario Atencio, and we saw a pretty new construction, big water tank, a taking of water, which was intended for the fracking industry. The people around have no water, but so how can that be if the water's 200% allocated and they have to, it's already divvied up? How is it that the state on this was state land, and so the state had to approve this? I mean, I know I'm asking you about a specific situation, but I'm asking, sort of generally. I don't understand how it is that the oil and gas industry can keep finding and getting water from the state when all the water is taken.
Well, the answer I'm going to give you is that it's all politics. I don't know the facts for the circumstance you describe, but up there around Chaco Canyon and on the Navajo Reservation, and if it was on state land, maybe there is unappropriated groundwater. Groundwater is different than surface water. I really was speaking to surface water before, renewable water. Groundwater is being managed so that you can use half of it in 40 years and half of what's left in the next 40, and on and on and on. But I would guess if you looked into the facts associated with that, you would find that the application was approved by the most recent state engineer who bent over backwards to basically give water to the oil and gas industry. And the current state engineer is in court over that in more than one place right now.
So you've spoken a little bit about the Gila and generally about water, but I've heard you say that that the problems facing the Rio Grande are serious. Can you explain a little bit about the past and present status of water in the Rio Grande and what led you to say that?
Well, I have to decide how to shorten a story that is about 140 years old into a minute or two. But basically, a controversy on the Rio Grande began in the late 1800s when development in Colorado caused the people down in Texas in the El Paso region to not have the water that they were accustomed to. And fast forwarding over a lot of territory, in 1938, Texas and Colorado and New Mexico and the United States of America signed a compact that basically divvied up the waters of the Rio Grande between the three states. It's federal and state law, and it doesn't reserve any water for nature. It allocates the entire flow of the river, whether it's small or in a flood year, to the three states, but it does specify the sharing agreements. I think the first Supreme Court lawsuit that compact drove was here in the Middle Rio Grande in the 1950s, and then the federal government said that it was an indispensable party to that lawsuit because of the Pueblo's rights that were unquantified then and remain unquantified today. And it refused to be joined in the lawsuit. Instead, it proposed to rebuild the local irrigation district here to make it much more efficient. And there's other complicating factors. Floods in the 1940s basically destroyed the river channel and made it very hard for the river itself to move water, through the middle Rio Grande region where we are now for the people who live in the El Paso region and Las Cruces region in New Mexico. So that lawsuit was settled and went away. And ever since then, everything has been fine, pretty much. But below Elephant Butte Dam, New Mexicans are entitled to 57% of the water that makes it to Elephant Butte Dam. And New Mexico is now in the Supreme Court with the state of Texas and the United States on the other side, claiming that New Mexico has used more than its share. I'm not going to comment too much about that, but I think it's big trouble for the state. And now in the Middle Rio Grande, where we have been not been in trouble since basically the 1960s, we ran a significant underdelivery. We're now in arrears on the amount of water that we must deliver through the Middle Rio Grande for use below Elephant Butte Dam. And this year, because it was so dry and because of public health issues, instead of cutting back and saving water so we could get ourselves out of debt, we used it all. So this year it looks like we're really going to be in arrears. And a compact violation could be just a year away. So that's a very difficult, it's a difficult issue to explain in a few words. We basically are obligated by law to not use more than our share. And we've not paid attention to that, and we've gotten away with it. But now we're using more than our share, and we don't know how to deal with it, and we're not prepared. And the result is going to be Supreme Court litigation that will be incredibly expensive, very painful. And if we lose, we'll be faced with the same problem we have today. How are we going to live within our means? And what are we going to do to live within our means? The Supreme Court won't tell us how we have to live with less. They will just insist that we do, and the problem will still be ours. I may not see that. I mean, Supreme Court litigation takes 10 or 15 years, but it's inevitable that we will have to do with less. The other side of the story is climate change. Climate change is dramatically altering the hydrology of the rivers in the Southwest. There's less snow in the mountains because of higher temperature. The dust that comes off degraded rangeland on the Navajo Reservation and elsewhere settles on the snow, creates a dark coating on the snow. The snow, instead of being saved up and saved up and saved up, and then in the spring it gets warm, and then all of a sudden it runs off, and we have these marvelous runoff events that last for a month or 6 weeks. The snow melts early because of this brown coating on top of it, and it trickles down into the dry mountain soils, and it never makes it into the rivers. Or the snow sublimates. The ice turns directly into water vapor without ever becoming a liquid. And so there's just less water. And then with increasing temperature, everything needs more water. The atmosphere wants more water. It evaporates more. Plants need more water to survive. It's called evapotranspiration. So their demand goes up. More water evaporates from the river and from our reservoirs and from our treasured cottonwood bosque that lines the river. So we will have substantially less, and our demands on it will be substantially greater.
So this is a little diversion, but I want to make sure that I pull it in. So when it comes to climate change and reducing emissions that contribute to climate change, you're working very hard in your piece of New Mexico to zero out your fossil fuel footprint or your emissions footprint. Can you tell us a little bit about that and just your personal commitment to contribute what you can?
Well, I live in an off-grid house, and I decided to live off-grid not because I wanted to live off-grid, but because I couldn't connect to electric utility and live in this beautiful place, and I wanted to live in this beautiful place more than have electricity, so I figured out how to live off-grid. Most recently, I've decided, because solar panel prices are a tenth of what I paid for them only 14 years ago, a tenth, that I could afford a lot more solar panels, and I now know enough about the technology that if I want to charge an electric car, I can do it in the day when the sun is shining, only in the day, in the daytime, and not have a carbon footprint associated with my personal transportation to go get groceries or go see the doctor or whatever in town. And then because I have extra electricity produced by the sun, on the days when I don't need it for car charging, I can use it to run a chiller heat pump, and I can cool and heat my house with refrigerated air off the sun. The unfortunate thing about it is that my personal household carbon footprint is only a fraction of my lifestyle carbon footprint because of the things that I consume and the food we eat and the industries over which we have no control. So we can do all we can, and we'll make a tiny little dent in the problem. What we have to do is to get the big boys off of their carbon addiction and onto carbonless energy, which is the sun.
So when we say we have to, when you say we have to get the big boys to do what's right in terms of their carbon footprint, who is best positioned to make them do what's right? We the people, individually, or government?
Well, it certainly isn't the government because we basically legalized bribery when we said that corporations can contribute as people. I mean, Citizens United basically legalized the bribery of elected officials as far as I'm concerned. And while there are lots of ethical elected officials and elected officials with good values, so many of them just follow the money. And they do what their campaign contributors want them to do, and without those campaign contributions, I guess they think they wouldn't be elected. But I think that for government to take the lead role here, we have to get money out of politics. We just have to.
Can you tell us quickly about how the first in time rule works when it comes to water?
Well, in the West, and you have to remember this was the age of manifest destiny. The West was being settled. It was the policy of the United States to encourage people to settle in the West. The only way that people could make a living was agriculture, right? There are very few other ways, natural resources development, but agriculture was the big one. So Western water law was developed, and basically what it says is the first person to put water to use has the superior right to that water. Now the doctrine has been altered substantially from its theoretical roots to serve the first person. But it used to be that under the theory, was if you needed water, you could take it, and you could use as much as you wanted as long as you needed it, and it belonged to the public. Well, the way it works now is that the original people, not the original because it's, the Native Americans were the first ones to use water, and their water rights in New Mexico are not yet quantified. But the first settlers got the superior rights, and every right subsequent to that is junior in terms of its seniority and its status. All of that means relatively nothing in New Mexico because nobody gets cut off. We never say that we have more use than we have water. So everybody gets to share the supply, and the result is that we overuse our allocation, which puts us in the jeopardy that we are now on the Rio Grande with regard to the claims of Texas and the United States, who insist that the downstream shares of the river be delivered for use downstream.
Except for people in nature, people wanting to recreate in nature, they don't have a space, really, a meaningful space in this.
They do not.
Hierarchy.
They do not. Natural uses of water are not recognized. I mean, one of the reasons that I've been able to enjoy the Gila River all of my life is that it is coming out of the mountains and it's above all uses. There are no uses, so the river flows wild and free up there, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
So do you think, and I know you've answered this, but I'm going to ask you some questions so you can answer them directly. Do you think that today New Mexico's legislators and government officials are giving the right level of attention to addressing water quality and quantity issues facing the state?
The answer is absolutely not. Under no circumstances could you say that adequate attention is being given. Water quality may get more attention than water quantity. That probably is because it is easier to understand, and I mean, people are concerned about pollution. The water resources issues are complex and difficult. We have a citizen legislature. They're unpaid. That's a shame. That needs to change too. But there are relatively few, almost no, legislative champions of water sanity in New Mexico. On the other hand, the oil and gas industry has many supporters, active supporters who lobby for their interests at every turn. Lobby and vote.
So now, understanding that we may have government officials that themselves are problematic, either because of their politics or because of the money they receive from industry lobbyists. So we sort of recognize that. But just looking at the law, environmental protection laws here in the state of New Mexico, do you think that the way these laws are written, the way they're interpreted, and the way they are utilized, are they up to the task of properly protecting New Mexico's environment and natural resources?
No. Limits to water resources are not recognized in state law. They may be recognized in state engineer regulations, which can be changed readily easily, but not in state law. There is nothing in state law that says that we need to be resilient or sustainable. There are laws that call for decent water plans to be prepared, but that hasn't happened either. Water quality protection, well, I was rather appalled to discover only recently that oil and gas wastewater spills are not even illegal. So the high pressure pipeline that burst down by Carlsbad and drenched a resident's home and livestock, that wasn't illegal. The only thing that would have been illegal about that would have been if they had failed to report it. The standards for cleanup are inadequate. I personally downloaded data from the state website that described all of these oil and gas wastewater spills that occurred over the last few years. In my professional opinion, they're almost all due to causes that are clearly negligent. Human error, overflow of tanks, corrosion, mechanical breakdown. Well, as an engineer, I dealt with water and wastewater equipment all my life, and I know that the way you prevent those kinds of failures is you train your people, you insist on a higher standard. When equipment wears out, you replace it, and you don't put highly corrosive liquid in steel containers that will rust through in a year. You just don't do those things. There's no standards for that equipment. The spills aren't illegal. They're not cleaned up. It's a mess. Now, in other areas of the state that don't have the big oil and gas footprint, it may be a different situation. I know here in Albuquerque that we have huge issues associated with groundwater contamination. But a combination of federal and state and local government efforts have served to not arrest those spills, but to deal with them and to force cleanups. I remember one particular case from when I was a city employee where the EPA, the state government, and the city of Albuquerque all sued the same recalcitrant polluter because he refused to take responsibility for the carcinogenic solvents that he had disposed of in a septic tank. Just letting it flow underground. And when that was discovered, the plume of contamination had extended more than a mile from the facility. Your question was, are the laws up to it at the state level? And the answer is no. Are the laws up to it at the federal level? It depends on how they're enforced and how they're administered. And generally, local government is given very little say about those kinds of things. In the case of Albuquerque, it was determined to protect its aquifer. Quite a lot's been done, but we still have a lot of threats.
So you've just talked about how the laws themselves, right? All the laws themselves are deficient in terms of properly protecting the environment. But you've also talked about how government officials in Albuquerque, for example, who were determined to protect their environment were actually very proactive, right? And so they found a way to fill the gap. So sort of thinking about those two extremes, thinking about other government officials speaking writ large in New Mexico, do you think that government officials are doing all they can and should do to protect the environment, being proactive, being creative, filling the gaps either with better laws or better implementation?
You know, I have to say it depends on who you're talking about, who is occupying that office at the moment. If you're talking about a bureaucrat, then you need to be looking at the elected officials, you know, who are giving the overall direction and the budgets. So I think the general answer to your question is the laws aren't sufficient. With determination, a lot can be done to achieve protection, but so much of it is up to the values of the people who are in charge at the time.
So here in New Mexico, given all of that, do you think that there would be value in putting in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution an enforceable recognition of the rights of all the people, including future generations, to pure water and clean air, a stable climate, and the natural, scenic, cultural, and healthful values of the environment, and making clear that all government officials emanating from state government, so the local town council to the legislators and the governor, are duty bound to protect the natural resources of the state for the benefit of all the people? Is that something that's...
Of course. And I think that one of the key phrases that you used that strikes so much of a chord with me is we pay no attention to our future generations. It's like we're in it for us and there's nobody after us. Well, we know that's not the truth. We have to come to grips with our impact on this planet and on our environment and on the ecology and everything that sustain us. And we have to figure out how to live within our means. So such direction to give that primacy, you know, to rate it with a very high priority just seems so important to me.
Do you have concerns about environmental justice here in New Mexico? Do you see environmental racism as part of the problem when it comes to thinking about the environment and environmental protection?
Well, I do, and I also have to confess that it's a relatively new recognition for me. I mean, some of the poorest areas in Albuquerque are down by the river and in the South Valley, and I don't know why that is, but what I do know is that wastewater flows downhill, and that's where the railroads are, and that's where the industries are. And there's definitely huge environmental justice issues with the way that we've developed here. Huge environmental justice issues with the way we've allowed oil and gas development to impact the Native Americans and their sacred and cultural sites, to deplete the groundwater. New Mexico, you know, I never really thought, growing up here, I never really thought of those issues in the terms of environmental justice. I mean, but it's a huge, it's definitely a problem, and it's something that has to be corrected.
So if there was a constitutional mandate to treat all people equitably, all people, do you think that that could help end environmental racism and enhance environmental justice
To treat all people equitably.
when it comes to
Environment.
environmental rights and environmental protection?
You know, it seems to me that equitable treatment is part of this nature's fabric, or this country's fabric. But when you look around, you see that that's really not the case. I think we have to make it explicit, and we have to figure out how we can get past these excesses of, frankly, my generation, you know, to get to a sustainable and resilient future. Otherwise, we don't have a place to inhabit. And that's for all of us, not for those that are socially or economically disadvantaged. They suffer the most, though, because they have the least amount of resources to be able to cope with the changes.
Who do you think would be against a Green Amendment, a constitutional environmental rights amendment like we're talking about?
Well, I would think
Only
it would
a few
be
more questions.
the extractive industries.
Mhm.
I would say in New Mexico, the land development folks. And, you know, they're very powerful lobbies here. I mean, New Mexico's economy depends on natural resources extraction and on development. So I think that you would find vociferous opposition from those sectors.
Understanding that in the first instance, a constitutional amendment is going to begin with the legislators, right, putting forth a resolution, and then it will go to the people. What would you want to say to those legislators that might be thinking about opposing a proposed Green Amendment? What would you want them to think about? What would you want to say to convince them to do the right thing?
I would ask them to think about the children and grandchildren and their children of their families and their friends and their neighbors and their schoolmates, and the future of this wonderful place that we're so fortunate to live in, as it will look in 50 years or 80 years or 100 years or beyond that if we do nothing. We just can't continue on the path we're on. It will result in environmental disaster for us all.
And so you're clearly very dedicated to environmental protection, whether in your professional career, doing it professionally, and then later turned activist, you know, fighting for the environment. Why are you, just on a personal level, why are you so dedicated to environmental protection? Why does it mean so much to you?
Well, where did I get my values is what you're asking me, and I think it's so important to me because I love this place where I live. I may not always act like it, but I love my fellow men and my fellow New Mexicans. I'm very concerned for our future. I understand the trends. I think I understand where they're going to take us. You know, and like when I intervened on the Gila, I thought they just needed help with the facts. Well, they need a lot of help with the facts, but we need a lot of help with our values and our concern, you know, for the future and for those yet unborn.
And so is there anything about all of this that I haven't asked you about or we haven't spoken about that you would like to share or say or make sure it gets captured?
Well, I just think that science and data are so important. I think that I would encourage, you know, young people to get into the physical sciences and the engineering sciences and to keep their values. We're a scientific society. You know, so much of what we do that has a negative impact on the environment is founded in science. And we need people, we need people who are literate in science and in data and in the complexities of this modern life. To be able to put up the factual arguments, to be able to listen to the scientists and take home the lessons. Right now, the state of the country, it seems to me, is really kind of encapsulated into there's the side that respects facts and science, and there's the side that says, I don't think science knows. I heard that quote recently from one of our great elected leaders. Well, science does know. And if we ignore it, we're turning our back on reality, and we will suffer the consequences.
So just one last thing. You've already expressed support for the Green Amendment concept, so I don't need to convince you, but I do want to share something with you. One of the things that we've demonstrated through litigation in Pennsylvania, one of the only 2 states where you have a Green Amendment, that one of the obligations that a Green Amendment creates, enforceable obligations, is the duty to consider the science and the facts and the cumulative impacts, and that if government officials can't show that they've properly considered the science, then they can't support their decisions in the face of a constitutional challenge. So I thought you might appreciate knowing that.
You know, I do appreciate that. One of my friends recently asked me for information about the Gila. And so I went into my old files, and lo and behold, I found the environmental impact statement for the creation of the Gila Wilderness. It was 20 pages long. The environmental impact statement for the Gila Diversion Project was, with all the appendices, 600 or 700 pages long. And you would have to study it to find the facts and science that were in it. It was mostly non-facts and non-science, and presented to obscure the truth rather than to reveal it. So it's not only that we have to pay attention to the facts and science, but we also have a duty to not obfuscate with these massive government-funded reports that nobody can penetrate, and unless you have a master's degree and you're retired like I am.
I was going to say, unless you have a norm.
But unfortunately, that's the facts. I was able, I think, to make a personal difference in the Gila because I had the time and the dedication and the engineering background to understand and take apart their arguments, to show that their models were false. To first of all, drag their models out of them with public records laws and then dissect them and show that they're wrong. That's an awfully tall burden. We have to have something like the Green Amendment. So it is the duty of the officials who write those reports to do it on the basis of facts and science, and not to obfuscate and let falsehoods drive their analysis and their conclusions.